Presented by Caltech.
Before I introduce the first speaker, I'd like to say a few words about my friendship with Carver Mead. And I'd like to start just by talking about luck. For all of you, every once in a while, a good piece of luck will come your way. You never know when it's going to come. Even when it does come, you might know that how lucky you've been, or you've been that lucky. But whatever that piece of luck is, try and grab it. The piece of luck for me occurred nearly 30 years ago now, when Carver invited me into his research lab here at Caltech. And that luck changed my life in terms of my career, in terms of everything I've done. And it also led to a friendship with Carver that's now nearly 30 years old. And over those 30 years, I learned a lot of things from Carver, many, many things. But as I thought about giving this introduction, I wanted to reflect on two of the things that I learned most of all. And although I learned a lot of science, neither of them are directly related to science. The first one is just what Carver embodies, which is to be inquisitive. Carver is always asking why. I mean, I kind of liken him sometimes to a little 2-year-old that you hear walking around and they're saying, why? Why is that? Why? Carver's always asking why. Why is something a certain way? Why should it be that way? And there's a quote in here in this New Adventures Fund booklet. It says, "It's about what you're allowed to believe." And that quote really embodies what Carver, how he is, the way he acts, the way he looks at things. I might even turn it around a little bit, which is question what you're allowed to question. Ask why about everything. Most people in life like to be grounded in things they think are facts or things that are known. They get comfort in those things, but Carver's the other way. He gets comfort when the ground is shifting, when everything's not known. And he can go out and be adventurous and try and put some framework, some understanding around those unknowns. And the second thing I learned from Carver is to be generous. Carver is perhaps the most generous person I know. He thinks about others before he thinks about himself. He gives to others before he takes for himself. One of the favorite sayings I have from Carver is, make the world a better place. As you leave this world, hope that you've made it a better place than when you arrived. And Carver really does act and behave that way, and this New Adventures Fund is just an embodiment of kind of the life that Carver lives, which is to give to others, to always think about others, to help others along. And for those of you who are his students, to help you ask the questions why, the same questions that he always asks. So back to that part about luck at the beginning. We are all lucky to be here at Caltech, every single one of us. And those of you who got funding from this New Adventures Fund are incredibly lucky to get that funding. And for those of us who have gotten the opportunity to know and be friends with Carver, we are the luckiest of all. Because I think I can speak for every person in this room that's known Carver. He has changed our lives. So with that luck, go out there and question everything. Ask the hard questions and try and find the hard answers. And as you do, give some of that luck to others. And hopefully, as you do that, you will make the world a better place. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. It's Professor Frederick Eberhardt. And Professor Eberhardt got his PhD at Carnegie Mellon University, did his postdoc at Berkeley, and came to Caltech via the Washington University in St. Louis. And he's going to speak today about developing methods for the automated discovery of causal relationships. So Professor Eberhardt.
Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, you might ask, why do you have a philosopher speaking, right? What went wrong there? And I often find myself that when I then say, well, I work on causality, that doesn't really help as an explanation of why you might want to have a philosophy there. It's like, why that? And in fact, often then it's not taken seriously at all. But when I was at a workshop recently, it said on the door that I do casual inference rather than causal inference. And so since then, the dress code in my lab is business causal, right? Not business casual anymore. But then in my neighborhood, I noticed that maybe they're advertising to me these days when they say, well, it's the causal wine experience that you can get. I wasn't quite sure whether that was a mistake or whether that was targeted advertising to the new Caltech professor in the neighborhood. So what I want to suggest, though, is that this question about what exactly causality is and what role it can play, whether it has any role in the sciences, is one that's worried a lot of people. And in particular, if you come from philosophy, Bertrand Russell is perhaps one of the very big people you have to worry about. And what he said in the 1910s was, all philosophers of every school imagine that causation is one of the fundamental axioms or postulates of science. Yet oddly enough, in advanced sciences such as gravitational astronomy, the word cause never appears. To me, it seems that the reason why physics has ceased to look for causes is that in fact there are no such things. The law of causality, I believe, like much that passes muster among philosophers, is a relic of a bygone age, surviving like the monarchy only because it is erroneously supposed to do no harm. Now, if Russell is one of the heroes in my field, so I'm up against a tall order in saying that I do actually care about causality, and unfortunately you can't just say, oh, the philosophers don't know what they're talking about. The statisticians said the same at the time. So here is Karl Pearson, who said, beyond such discarded fundamentals as matter and force lies yet another fetish amongst the inscrutable arcana of modern science, namely the category of cause and effect. So if both the statisticians and the philosophers think there is no such thing as cause, or that we should worry about causation, or that we should not worry about causation in our scientific inference, then you might wonder, okay, what am I doing here now talking about it? I think actually that this sort of way of discarding causality in the first half of the 20th century has done an enormous amount of harm to the way that we think in the sciences. I think it has led us to write papers and make claims that replace causal notions with ones that are far more ambiguous. You talk about variables being linked, you talk about X results in or lowers or promotes Y, that it increases the probability of Y, or that there's some strong connection without actually telling me what the connection is, or that you do a regression between variables and then leave it just ambiguous. I didn't say anything about causality, but you know they're linked. Well, but I care about causality, right? So that's what actually matters. So I think these sorts of headlines that you find on all sorts of papers are ultimately speaking to causal questions. And in order to assess whether you care about that relation, you might care whether that relation is actually causal. So I think it's actually that we should think more carefully about what the role of causality could be, how we should understand this sort of scientific concept, and then and then think how we could investigate these sorts of questions in a rigorous way. And I think the core distinction that we care about when we talk about causality is perfectly clear. While we nowadays all look at our phones to predict the weather tomorrow, right? You know that perhaps underlying that is the old barometer. And the barometer is an excellent predictor of the weather, but of course it doesn't cause the weather tomorrow, right? In fact, we think that something like the atmospheric pressure is a common cause of both the barometer and the weather tomorrow. And intervening on the barometer needle doesn't do anything to the weather tomorrow, though kudos to the organizers here, you did very well on the weather for today. But so what we care about is we see the correlation between a barometer and the weather tomorrow. We think it's an excellent correlation for ordinary prediction, but it doesn't help us with what happens under intervention. In contrast, of course, the barometer reading might cause me to take my umbrella with me tomorrow, and there it's then a causal relation because it's sustainable under intervention. And so I think the kind of ambiguity that we want to tease apart in the headlines that I was citing before is precisely this distinction between, are we dealing with a dependence between relations that is due to confounding or just spurious, or are we dealing actually with a relationship between variables that is sustainable under intervention, and that would be then a causal one. So I think that contrary to Russell and Karl Pearson, we should actually take causation very seriously. I think understanding of the causal relations within a system is in many domains, even here at Caltech, the ultimate goal of scientific research. I think that in causal understanding is central to predicting the effects under interventions, just like I suggested in the previous slide. And that, of course, also in the law, and you might care about causation with regard to the attribution of blame and responsibility. So for those reasons, I think it's something that we should think about mathematizing, about making precise, and then working out in some detail. So the standard mantra goes that correlation does not imply causation. That doesn't help very much because it just tells us what doesn't work. But then, of course, the question is, what then does imply causation? And a causality, I think, is a particularly complicated kind of concept because it's not something that you somehow read off from the data, but that you have to infer from the data. And very quickly, I get the kind of response that, well, what you do to identify causality is you perform an experiment, but I don't think that that is even the right attitude to take, that even in an experiment you have to make substantial assumptions about how you're intervening and what the effect of your intervention is before you can identify anything about causality. And I want to give you an example that actually came here from California a while ago, that people realized that there was some connection between the class size and learning outcomes, that perhaps the size of the classes that you study in has some effect on how well you learn. Well, if you think that's a causal connection, then you might intervene on the class size, and that's indeed what they did. They hired more teachers and reduced the class sizes, but at the same time, while hiring more teachers, because you were hiring so many teachers, you were also intervening on teaching quality, because the teachers that you were hiring were not as good anymore. And so as a consequence, this relationship between class size and learning outcome was ambiguous again. It's not clear whether actually class size was the effect of learning, had an effect on learning outcomes, or whether it was actually the teaching quality that mattered more. So here again, I think in order to tease apart exactly what you can infer from an intervention or an experiment depends very much on the kinds of background assumptions you make. And so in a similar way, if you can think of inferring causal relations from observational data, then of course you're going to need background assumptions. It's something that you infer from data, but it's not that it's impossible. And so we should really think about then, well, how can we actually infer causality? And so the framework I have been working in is called Causal Graphical Models. It was developed by Judea Pearl and a group of rather technical philosophers at Carnegie Mellon, Peter Spirtes, Clark Lemore, and Richard Shyness, who axiomatized or mathematized causation in terms of these graphical frameworks where you have nodes connected by arrows. And I think, just to give you a very broad sense of what's going on within this framework, is that one way to think about it is that it connects central concepts of causation to one another. And so in particular, you want to connect the underlying causal relation to what you actually observe in data, so the connection between the causal relation and the probability distribution of the data that is generated under observation. And then, of course, importantly, you also want to say something about what happens under intervention. So if I intervene on a variable, then that has some effect on the overall causal structure, but it might have a very local causal effect. It doesn't destroy everything. So you want to connect your model that you have under observational circumstances to the kind of model that you have under interventional circumstances. And perhaps one of the most central insights you can, if you're familiar with probability theory, here you see that there's this odd do operator in the conditioning, after the conditioning bar, is that normal probability theory would not be enough, because you have to distinguish between an interventional probability, one that you see in an experiment, and a conditional probability. So if I want to talk about my data conditional on some variable, then I'm going to infer something very different from when I talk about my data given that I intervened on the variable. Think about the barometer again. Conditional on the barometer reading, what is the weather going to be tomorrow? It's a good prediction. Conditional on that I intervened on the barometer reading, you're going to say, I don't know anything about the weather tomorrow, right? So you need to distinguish these two things, and the causal graphical model framework does this very nicely. The third concept that I think plays an enormous role with regard to attributions of blame and responsibility is that causality ties in notions of counterfactuals. So that means what would have happened if things had been different. And so that is very different from a question of what would happen if I intervene to do something. And so tying together these notions of observation, intervention, and counterfactuals, I think ties together notions that are central to understanding causality. And with the causal graphical models framework, there's a mathematical framework that we can now use and apply to data and learn something from data about the underlying causal relations. Okay, so then what does it mean to automatically discover causal relations? And so the underlying picture at a very high level is the one I suggest here, is that there's an underlying ground truth about the causal relations that are there. We don't get to see that ground truth, but that can be represented in terms of this type of graphical model. And all we get to see is the data, the samples that are generated from the underlying ground truth, and that might be data generated under experimental circumstances or under observational circumstances. And then what we want to build, this is the kind of business that I've been involved in, is that we want to build algorithms that under particular well-specified assumptions can provably recover as much as possible about the underlying causal structure. And of course, it will sometimes be the case that given the assumptions you're making, you're not going to uniquely identify the causal structure, but then you at least want to say, what are the kinds of equivalence classes or constraints or general causal features that are shared among those things that you can distinguish from the remaining causal structures? So here I'm suggesting that those three causal structures on the right there might actually be in some sense equivalent. Now, there are many more causal structures over three variables, so if I can reduce it to this might already get me a little bit further than I started off with. Okay. So rather than go through more technical details, I thought that I'd show you some examples of where we applied exactly this approach, especially because we did this as part of the sponsorship that we got as part of this program. And so the example I want to start off with is on Zebrafish. Let me just, before I go to Zebrafish, say something about what we can do on causal inference now. There's an enormous set of algorithms now that have been built by many people around the world that can work just from purely observational data, so you don't need experiments at all. You can work in time series data. You can think about what happens when there's feedback among the variables, or even if there's unmeasured confounding. We can integrate experimental and observational data, and we can now scale. We can now really talk about what are the causal relations among tens of thousands or even 100,000 variables. Okay, I want to give you one example of the learning causal structure over 100,000 Zebrafish are a model organism in many ways and for many reasons, but one of the reasons why zebrafish are something of interest to science is that in their larval state they're translucent. And so you can actually look at what's going on, and then if you ensure that you attach calcium indicators to the neurons in the larval zebrafish, then actually when the neurons activate, it's like a little light bulb going off for each neuron. So it's absolutely amazing technology. It's light sheet microscopy where you can now collect data over each of the 80,000, roughly 80,000 neurons of a larval zebrafish in close to real time. It's not quite real time, but it's measured at 3 Hertz. So the kind of data that we've been working with is full brain zebrafish data measured at 3 Hertz over the 80,000 neurons that are present in the zebrafish larvae. And so what we were interested in is that, well, what are the connections among the individual neurons of the zebrafish larvae? Can we discover this just by looking at this type of time series data? So to give you a sense of what this sort of data looks like, this is a still from a movie, just so to make it a little bit easier here. You're looking at 80,000 or a projection of 80,000 neurons here, and basically these are all little light bulbs that will light up or flash in different intensities, and you're measuring them 3 times a second, and we can have basically track exactly the activation of each of these neurons 3 times a second for the entire brain. And so then the question is, well, feed this now into a causal discovery algorithm and tell me what you get out. And so what we get out is something like this. And when I sent it to my colleagues who work on zebrafish, they thought I was sending them a Rorschach test, maybe. But in fact, the problem here is that we get a causal graph out and you send it to the domain experts, and they don't know what to do with it because we don't know this level of detail yet about the zebrafish brain. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, are we just getting noise here, or are we getting something actually real? So what we looked at then in more detail is to say that what sort of known connections are there in the zebrafish brain? And so we looked at the connection between the cerebellum and the inferior olive. And what you see here is now just a subset of the connections from the previous graph, where and we see these direct connections crossing over from the inferior olive into the cerebellum. And it turns out that these connections were actually known from lesion studies that Misha Arens and his colleagues did at Janelia. So these results from lesioning study from lesioning the inferior olive indicate that the inferior olive is necessary for successful adaptation of motor programs to external feedback gain. One hypothesis is that an error signal is computed in the inferior olive, which then activates appropriate circuits in the cerebellum via clymine fibers. Now, for us, we didn't know this thing. We plugged in the data, we turned the crank on the data, and what we recover is precisely these sorts of direct connections between the inferior olive and the cerebellum, and we do so not only in one zebrafish, but across a whole pile of different zebrafish. So you're learning the causal graph over 80,000 neurons and then recovering things that are known in the literature. So now it becomes interesting to ask what other connections that were not known in the literature can we hypothesize and then actually check on. So this is very exciting for me, I think, because here the causal graphical models approach is really actually giving something back to the domain scientists in trying to find out what's going on here. Let me give you then a different idea. Once we do the zebrafish, we're of course interested in, well, can we do something about humans as well, right? Unfortunately, the human brain is not so translucent, so we can't, and it's rather larger, so we can't compute it in exactly this way. So one way to approach this problem of learning the causal structure in the human brain is to parcellate it into regions of interest within the brain. These parcellations can be anatomically informed, and so what you're seeing here in the middle is the correlation matrix among brain parcels, where the brain is parcellated into roughly 400 different sections, the left hemisphere on the top and the right hemisphere on the bottom. And so we would like now to learn the causal structure over these parcels. Can we do that sort of thing? And we used, in this case, an enormous open access database that was collected as part of the Human Connectome project, which has about data from about 1,200 healthy adults in there. And this is resting state fMRI data. In fact, for this, within this database, they also collected MEG and EEG data and then also behavioral data. So there's an enormous amount of further inference that we want to explore, not just in terms of causal connections within the brain, but also causal connections from the brain outwards to behavior. And so here is a matrix of the correlations among different parcels of the brain. And what you see quite clearly are these connections here on the off diagonals that are connections between the two hemispheres of your brain. So this is connections through the corpus callosum, the main fiber bundle connecting the two hemispheres. And so we were interested, well, can we say something about what the causal connections are? What are the direct connections rather than the mere correlations between these regions? And this is what we get on the right-hand side. And what's really striking about this, the way to read this image is the following, is the top left quadrant is the left hemisphere, the bottom right quadrant is the right hemisphere, and the other two quadrants are the connections that go between hemispheres. And so if you look at this, and then the upper triangle is across many subjects, the lower triangle is just for a single subject. If you look at this, what you see is that there's enormous similarity in causal structure within each of the hemispheres. So the hemispheres are very similar in terms of causal structure. And strikingly, if you look at the interhemispheric connections, they all seem to be between parcels that are corresponding parcels in each hemisphere of your brain. So the front left of your brain is talking to the front right of your brain. So if the front left wants to talk to the back right of your brain, then it has to go directly across to its corresponding parcel first and then back, or first back and then across. So a little bit of a Manhattan distance in your brain, maybe. I think this is, obviously, this is at a granularity still of causal connection that is very coarse, because we're looking only at 400 regions of interest for the human brain, and we know that there are 10 billion neurons in the human brain, and so it will be interesting to refine on this in much more detail. Given that we think we're actually getting somewhere with this, we thought we'd look at mice as well. And actually, if we do the same analysis in mice, you see remarkably similar structure in the mouse brain. If you, just from fMRI data, you might say, okay, that's not that surprising, but actually we were very surprised that both the interhemispheric, so just to look at this slide, if you use the scientific method of squinting at the right panel, you will see that also the interhemispheric connections are very sparse except for the diagonals, and that the structure between the hemispheres is very similar. So given that we think this is working quite well. We now want to extend out further, and the overall picture that we have is that we want to connect this type of causal inference among the neural level to psychological variables. So we're keen on building up a kind of neuroscientifically informed psychology, where we then look at, can we learn the causal connections among parcels of the brain, and can we then aggregate those up to psychological variables so that we can talk about how the psychological variables are instantiated in the brain. And this is stuff that is very much still work in progress, and you'll have to come back maybe in 2 years to hear the results of this in greater detail. I want to close just by noting that, of course, this work was done with many, many collaborators, both here at Caltech and across the country. And I, in particular, colleagues are great, but actually Caltech undergrads are far better. So I want to highlight in particular the work of R.J. Antonello and Ethan Pronovost. And Ethan actually is going to have a poster out here tonight. And then the other thing that I want to say is that we got a seed grant for this sort of work. And it really did its job as a seed, and those two grants that we actually received, they're not proposals, they're funded, were directly connected to this sort of work that came out of the seed grant. So I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Eberhardt. So are there questions? Can you step up to the mic?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Sure. That was very interesting. One of your slides noted that you have established as much relationships up to 100,000 parameter.
Yeah, so we can learn a graph over about 100,000 variables.
Now, I'm just curious, do you know if your technology has been applied to protein folding? Since protein folding is a big, and also organic chemistry, femtoreactions, where we need to have the shape of the amino acid, and there's so many possibilities.
Yeah, so you're not the first to ask that question. So I'm not actually aware. So people are using this technology at the moment on gene regulatory networks as well, but specifically on protein folding, I don't know of anyone working on that directly. I think in many ways, this technology has come online at this scale only over the last 2 or 3 years. And so now it's a matter of really connecting to the domain experts who know what they're doing in this domain. So no, I think the short answer is no, I don't know anyone who's doing it on protein folding.
Okay, thank you very much.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, one more.
I'm just curious why this falls within philosophy.
Well, so that was half an answer there, is that, I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to come to Caltech was that I was permitted to do this in philosophy here, so I was not an odd one out in the philosophy department. But so here's a more serious answer to that, is that think of the first slides that I had in terms of the rejection of the notion of causality actually across the disciplines in the first half of the 20th century, is that causality was in many ways a dirty word in scientific circles. And as a result, it was not developed in statistics at all, really, until perhaps the 70s. And only really started catching on in statistics again in the late 20th century. So I think in many ways the philosophers in this case preserved this notion of causality as a scientific concept and developed it into the kind of mathematical framework that we are working with now. And well, I think of philosophy in many ways as a kind of generator of disciplines where then things branch off into the sciences, and that's then just fine if you want to partition the philosophy there already, that it should stick to its less well understood concepts. But I'm perfectly happy of thinking of that. We're sitting with regard to causality, we're sitting on a branch that's going out into the sciences, and we're halfway there perhaps. Anyone else?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.